Thank you very much for the possibility to be here today. I want to say some words about the geopolitical situation of our world today in the year 2011. It may come as no surprise to most of you that in 1991, from the side of the remaining sole superpower, the Cold War never ended. Instead, when the Warsaw Pact dissolved and the Soviet Union with it, NATO continued to expand eastward, right up to the borders of Russia. The methods of this new Cold War were transformed, and instead of nuclear weapons, although that remained, the weapons became the International Monetary Fund and Harvard University shock therapy from Jeffrey Sachs and others. The strategic aim was and remains today the dismantling of Russia as a functioning nation in order to control Eurasia. In his now famous book, The Great Chess Game, Zbigniew Brzezinski, a consultant to every president since Jimmy Carter, noted that Eurasia is the only landmass on the face of the earth with the population, the natural resources, the intellectual capabilities to pose a challenge to America's sole hegemony. 10 years ago, the primary focus of U.S. foreign policy was the encirclement of Russia, militarily and otherwise. Today, the primary emphasis is the encirclement of the rising power of China and driving a wedge between China and Russia on many levels. The Pentagon's strategy of destabilization from Afghanistan through Pakistan, across through the Middle East, oil-producing countries, onto northern Africa, Libya, southern Sudan, and so forth, the so-called Arab Spring, is a strategy aimed at controlling China and Central Asia, Eurasia. To better understand the mentality of American strategy, it's useful to go back to the year 1939, before the Second World War was even declared. At that time, America's most influential private think tank, the New York Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, was commissioned by the Rockefeller Foundation to carry out a top-secret, long-term strategy for how America would essentially rule the world as the victor of the coming World War. The project was called the War and Peace Studies of the Council on Foreign Relations and included America's leading geopolitical strategist, geographer Isaiah Bowman, the president of Johns Hopkins University, and other leading figures who later went to the State Department. And one thing they resolved quite early as they were mapping out the geopolitical pivot areas of the world that they would dominate after the war was the idea that they would not make the mistake that the British had made of calling theirs an American empire. Instead, they would call their mission Extending Democracy, Freedom, and the American free enterprise system to the oppressed parts of the world. It was a brilliant propaganda strategy. And as people such as John Kennan, the famous Mr. X of the Foreign Affairs article, who authored the strategy of containment of the Soviet Union and initiated the Cold War together with people around President Truman. As Kennan and others noted, the prime mission of American foreign policy is to keep the gains, the disproportionate gains that America had won in the war, and not let sentimentality get in the way. This War and Peace Studies group, under Professor Isaiah Bowman, developed the strategy that was later called the United Nations Organization and the related International Monetary Fund and World Bank that were part of that, at the Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. And the real dawn of the American century and the American dollar system of Bretton Woods took place not in June of 1944 at the conference in New Hampshire. It took place on August 9th, 1945, with the dropping of the atomic bomb on the civilian population in Japan. The message of that atomic bomb on a civilian population was a clear signal to the entire world, but especially to Russia, the Soviet Union, and that there is only one bully on the block, and the name is the United States of America. The real architect of America's foreign policy and geopolitical strategy after World War II, however, was not Isaiah Bowman and the group at the Council on Foreign Relations. It was rather an Englishman with the name Sir Halford Mackinder, a geographer. And in 1943, shortly before his death, Mackinder authored a piece in Foreign Affairs magazine on the role that America would play in a post-war world geopolitically as a dominant superpower, or the dominant superpower. Mackinder's geopolitical strategy went back to a work he did in 1919 in the context of the Versailles peace talks, where he outlined a very simple axiom. The power that controls Central Europe, by which he meant Germany, France, Poland, and the region adjoining, that power has the capacity to control what he called the heartland, by which he meant the Russian Empire. And the power that controls the heartland of Eurasia is able to control the world island, as he called it, that is the entire landmass, including India and down into the Middle East, the Persian Gulf countries and parts of Africa, and of course Western Europe. And the power that controls the world island controls the world. What Mackinder didn't say is the corollary. British grand strategy is and remains, and later American grand strategy, the preventing of that control or that alliance between Central Europe countries, European countries, and the Eurasian heartland. And in 1943, it was not yet clear for Mackinder what the status of Germany would be in that strategy in the post-war world, but he envisioned two powers on the Eurasian landmass that would have to be controlled, either Russia, the Soviet Union, the pivot land as he called it, or China. Could I ask if people would turn off their mobile telephones during the course of the lecture as a courtesy? Thank you. And in the post-war period, where virtually every Secretary of State of the United States has been a protege of the Rockefeller Group, including Cyrus Vance, including John Foster Dulles, including Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski, it's no surprise that Mackinder geopolitics has informed American foreign policy up to the present day. Perhaps the most successful of these foreign secretaries or secretaries of state in the post-war period, Henry Kissinger, allegedly made a famous statement in the middle of the 1970s when the world had a simultaneous oil price crisis, a 400% rise in the price of petroleum, and at the same time a world grain price explosion. At that time, Kissinger reportedly, and he was the most powerful man in Washington in the early 1970s, as Nixon was fighting Watergate, Kissinger supposedly said that if you control the oil, you control entire nations, and he meant the United States controlling the oil. If you control the food, you control the people. If you control the money, you control the entire world. And if we look back at the history of U.S. foreign policy and intelligence agency policy as well as Pentagon policy over the past 50 or so years, we find a series of wars that can be traced back to American intervention, interference, destabilizations, etc., for control of that oil. It began in the the early 1950s with the CIA destabilization of the Mossadegh regime in Iran and bringing the Shah back into power in Iran as a more or less puppet of the Rockefeller family. In 1973, it entailed a manipulation at a secret planning conference in Saltsjöbaden outside of Stockholm in Sweden, where the most powerful private persons from the United States and Europe, including the Rockefellers, including Henry Kissinger, including the heads of British Petroleum, Royal Dutch Shell, the Rothschilds, and others, discussed and debated an imminent 400% increase in the price of OPEC petroleum. And in 2000, I had the honor of being invited by Sheikh Zaki Yamani to his home in London to discuss my book, A Century of War. And at that discussion, Yamani asked me how I came by the information that I had in my book about the 1973 oil crisis. And I explained to him in great detail how I put the pieces of the puzzle together. He was astonished, and he told me, Professor Engdahl, he called me a professor. I said, I'm no professor. He said, Professor Engdahl again. You are the only person who's put this picture together that I know of what really happened in 1973. When I was sent by my king to Tehran to ask the Shah why Iran was demanding such an extremely high oil price in December 1973, the Shah told me I should tell my king, if he wants the answer, go to Washington and ask Henry Kissinger. And the same strategy that was applied of controlling the price of oil on the world market in 1973 to increase the price and maintain the hegemony of the American dollar in a system where gold was no longer supporting it. The strategy was reversed in 1986. And in 1973, it served the purposes of the Wall Street banks and the oil giants to have a 400% increase in the price of oil, to stop industrial growth in developing countries and lay the basis for the third world debt crisis of the 1980s. And in 1986, it suited their needs to do the opposite. And there was a discussion in the State Department between Secretary George Shultz, Vice President George Herbert Walker Bush, the father, and various others about convincing Saudi Arabia to flood the world oil market with oil, which they did loyally and dutifully, in order to collapse the world price of oil. And that collapse in the world oil price to below $10 a barrel from around $30 in a matter of months indirectly led to the collapse 3 years later of the Soviet Union. The US, during the 1980s, insidiously manipulated events in the Middle East between Iran and Iraq to create a bloody, painful war between those two countries in order to control the world oil markets. The United States manipulated, after the end of that Iran-Iraq war, manipulated a desperate and indebted Saddam Hussein to think he could walk in and take the oil riches of Kuwait. That was a trap set for Saddam Hussein by the US. And the US ensuing war against Iraq on the trumped-up claim that it was threatening Saudi oil fields was the beginning of a new phase of direct US Pentagon militarization with permanent bases of the entire Middle East region. And 10 years later, under a new president, in September of 2001, a new phase in what we might call this series of oil wars was initiated. It was called the War Against Terrorism. I'll leave it to you to entertain various theories of whether 19 Arabs with no serious flying experience, armed with box cutters, could commandeer 4 commercial airliners in U.S. airspace, including violating the Pentagon airspace, and go undetected from North American air defense for 93 minutes and do what was done to the World Trade Towers, 3 of them, by the way, and the Pentagon. I'll leave it to you to entertain different theories. I don't want to talk about that today. For the Bush-Cheney administration and the neoconservative warhawks in the cabinet, such as Paul Wolfowitz, it would not have mattered if Donald Duck had taken responsibility for the World Trade Towers. They were set on an agenda of a war on terror that would be directed against the entire Islamic world, from Afghanistan to Morocco. And the entire decade of the 1990s was consumed with a series of surrogate and direct oil wars in Central Asia. Chevron moved in to grab the oil resources of Tengiz in Kazakhstan, as well as British Petroleum in Baku with the Caspian oil riches. U.S. intelligence sent operatives into Chechnya to sabotage the possibility of Baku oil flowing through Russian pipelines. And after 2000, the U.S. began to prepare, using NGOs, so-called human rights non-governmental organizations, they began to prepare a series of color revolutions aimed directly at Moscow, most importantly putting in Mr. Saakashvili in Georgia and the Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2003-2004. And the aim of bringing Ukraine into NATO, along with Poland, Bulgaria, and all the other former Warsaw Pact countries that have been brought into NATO, the aim with Ukraine was to control the export pipelines of Russia to the West. This is the background against which to judge the actions of then President Putin and the Russian government in arresting Mikhail Khodorkovsky of Yukos Oil. Khodorkovsky, at the time of his arrest, was in negotiations with George Herbert Walker Bush and a powerful investors group in Washington tied to the Pentagon and CIA of selling 40% of Yukos Sibneft to American interests, whether Exxon or Chevron. And he was also in the process, reportedly, of buying the votes of the Russian Duma to make himself the next president, and also to change the raw materials law of Russia so that he could privately control oil and gas resources and pipelines. By the end of the decade, the American establishment decided to shift tactics in terms of emphasis, and instead of having the hardline Bush-Cheney aggressive administration, they would put a softer, kinder, gentler face to the world named Barack Obama. And Barack Obama was a master demagogue who was elected president with the same special interest money that George Bush and Dick Cheney had been elected or installed, namely Wall Street money, the military-industrial complex, and big oil. The American leopard was simply changing its spots, but it was still a leopard. One of the first things that President Obama began was escalating the war in Afghanistan, because the focus was shifting, and talk about a reset of American-Russian relations, because the priority was now becoming the containing of Chinese economic growth and influence. And the U.S. military presence in Afghanistan has virtually nothing to do with controlling the Taliban or something called Al-Qaeda, whatever that is. Had nothing to do with hunting down Osama bin Laden, who reportedly died 10 years before. It was about building a network of permanent air bases throughout Afghanistan, from Bagram and elsewhere, aimed strategically at China and potentially at Russia. A military footprint right in the middle of Eurasia, controlled by the United States for the first time in history. In 2008, on the eve of my first visit to the People's Republic of China, I researched the background of the events in Tibet when there were riots allegedly by Han Chinese businessmen against Tibetan monks in March of 2008. And what I discovered in my research was that all the same non-governmental organizations involved in the color revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine and elsewhere were also involved in the events supporting the Dalai Lama's demand for independence of Tibet. I also found an obscure foundation financed by the American billionaire and geopolitical operative named George Soros. And I mentioned the Trace Foundation in my article, and the next day I flew to Beijing, having sent the article to a political website of a friend of mine in Canada, and not thinking more of it. And in my article I essentially argued that in my view, that the riots and the incitements in Tibet were aimed at embarrassing the Chinese on the eve of the Summer Olympics in Beijing, and the beginning of a whole series of pinprick provocations against growing Chinese power by the United States and NATO. And a year later, in 2009, in Xinhua province, which is a crucial crossroads for oil and gas pipelines between Kazakhstan, Russia, and China, as well as Chinese oil fields, the same NGOs were active in creating riots. In 2008, the Pentagon created an entire new command dedicated to the military control of Africa, the AFRICOM, Africa Command. And the reason for that was the growing success of Chinese economic diplomacy across Africa, gaining long-term supplies of oil, gas, and other raw materials for the Chinese economy. The destabilizations that we've seen in recent months, the so-called Arab Spring, are part of this AFRICOM strategy of regime change in parts of Africa and the Middle East to create a situation more friendly to United States long-term designs. Muammar Gaddafi had many faults, no doubt, but his main fault in Washington eyes was that he didn't sing the same sheet of music that Washington wanted. He had begun to grant oil concessions to Chinese and Russian oil companies, among others, and he was attempting to organize a Pan-African Union, economic union, that would be less dependent on the International Monetary Fund and U.S. pressures. And at the same time, almost unnoticed to the world, U.S. NGOs successfully broke off southern Sudan and its oil riches that are a main source of oil supplies to China, and created an independent Republic of South Sudan, whose oil flows very soon will be going through Kenya rather than Port Sudan. I just returned 3 weeks ago from extensive talks in Beijing with various think tanks and people in different positions, and I can assure you that they are well aware that this grand strategy of events in Africa and the Middle East is directed very much against Chinese economic oil security. But in my view, the decision in Washington to violate every precept of the United Nations Charter and international law by declaring war on Libya in March of this year was not made out of strength of the United States position in the world, but out of fundamental weakness. And the weakness goes right back to the heart of the American system that was set up at the end of the Second World War, namely the control of money through Wall Street, the Federal Reserve, and the U.S. Treasury. In my new book, The Gods of Money, that's just come out in Russian language, I detail the entire process of the increasing takeover of American policy and politics by a group of 6 major banks centered in Wall Street: Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, Citigroup, Morgan Stanley, Bank of America. So far, since 2007, more than $14 trillion of taxpayer money and Federal Reserve balances have poured into those 6 banking institutions banks that are deemed to be too big to save, too big to fail, and I say they're too big to save. And the result of that bank bailout has been the destruction of the American economy and the worst economic depression since the 1930s. In this global crisis that we're in right now, I call it an epochal crisis, one that we see perhaps every 400 or 500 years in history. In this crisis, there is one alternative that certain elite circles in Western Europe are looking at very nervously as a future option out of the crisis, and that is Eurasia. The role of the dollar as reserve currency is the only thing that allows Washington to finance its wars against Russia, China, and the nations of Eurasia, including Iran. And the current crisis of Greece, the crisis of Euroland, was detonated deliberately by Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan Chase, American rating agencies, and the Federal Reserve with the express aim of preventing the euro from replacing the dollar as world reserve currency. Continental European elite circles, in my view, I'm talking about Germany, France, primarily, and Italy, are schizophrenic regarding Eurasia and their relationship to Eurasia. They know on the one hand that any future growth in German or French or Italian exports will not come from American markets, North American markets, but from Eurasian markets, whether it be Eastern Europe, Russia, China, India. At the same time, they fear a break with the Atlantic Bridge, with NATO, which is a US-controlled organization, of course, because of the awesome military power and blackmail power that the Americans have over Western Europe, or the Eurozone countries. I see only one possibility out of this crisis for countries such as Russia, China, and I've said this in both countries, as well as Western Europe, the Middle East, and Africa, and that is a closer economic, political, and yes, military cooperation between the two great powers of Eurasia, China and Russia. That combination would bring in all of the countries of Central Asia with it, as well as major allies within the Middle East, oil-producing countries, and also parts of Africa. And that could literally transform the map of the world into a multipolar world where such madness that we've seen over the last years would no longer be tolerated. There is an alternative to this cooperation of Eurasian countries that I just mentioned, and it's one that I personally would not like to contemplate. That is what the Pentagon calls full spectrum dominance, control of land, oceans, air, space, outer space, and cyberspace by the US Pentagon war machine. As an American, and speaking on what I feel are the best interests of the American population as well as the rest of the world, I think we deserve better than a Pentagon-ruled global one-world government. Thank you.